The pit is 1 mile wide and 1,800 feet deep. From the viewing platform on the edge of town, tourists take photographs of what looks like a terraced canyon carved into the earth, a massive wound in the landscape that fills slowly with water the color of rust and poison. The Berkeley Pit holds 50 billion gallons of acidic water contaminated with arsenic, cadmium, zinc, copper, and sulfuric acid. The pH level hovers around 2.5, roughly the same as stomach acid or battery fluid. Nothing lives in this water. Nothing can. In 1995, a flock of 342 snow geese landed on the water during their autumn migration south. They were tired from flying. The pit looked like a lake, a place to rest before continuing their journey. By morning, all 342 were dead, their esophagi and internal organs corroded by the toxic soup they had mistaken for sanctuary. Workers in hazmat suits collected the bodies and disposed of them as hazardous waste. The geese had become part of the pit, absorbed into its chemistry, their deaths a warning that nobody outside Butte seemed to hear. The pit sits at the edge of Butte, Montana, a city built on the richest hill on Earth. For 50 years, men tunneled beneath these streets, descending thousands of feet into darkness, extracting copper that electrified America, that wired cities for light and power, that connected telephones and powered telegraphs and made the modern world possible. They called it the richest hill on Earth because it was. More wealth came out of this ground than from any gold rush, any silver strike, any oil field in American history. $1 billion in copper, silver, gold, and zinc at 19th century prices. Tens of billions in today's money. Enough to build mansions on Fifth Avenue and finance railroads across continents and buy politicians by the dozen and transform the American West into an industrial colony. The wealth went to New York and San Francisco and London, to stockholders who never saw the mines and executives who visited only to inspect their holdings. The men who dug it out stayed in Butte, and 10,000 of them never left. They are buried here still, in graves scattered across the hillside cemeteries, in mine shafts that collapsed without warning, in tunnels that flooded or filled with poisonous gas or simply swallowed men who were never found, whose bodies remain entombed in the darkness 1,000 feet below the streets where their descendants still walk. 10,000 dead in the mines of Butte, Montana, more than any other mining district in North America, more than many wars that have monuments in Washington. Their monument is the pit, the poisoned water, the contaminated soil, the Superfund site that will require cleanup for generations to come. The city that rises around the pit looks like it survived a disaster, which it did. Headframes from abandoned mines jut against the sky like skeletal monuments. Victorian mansions decay on hillsides next to company housing that was never meant to last. The population that peaked at 100,000 has fallen to 35,000, and many of those who remain are too old or too poor or too stubborn to leave. They live in the shadow of the pit and the memory of what this place once was, when copper was king and Butte was the beating heart of American industry. Can a city survive the wealth that built it? Can a community outlast the resource that created it? Can the richest hill on Earth become anything other than a poisoned monument to extractions and abandonment? This is the story of Butte, Montana, the copper kings who built empires on the labor of immigrants, the miners who died by the thousands in tunnels beneath the city, the battles between workers and owners that shaped American labor law, and the toxic legacy that remains, spreading slowly through the groundwater, a problem too large to solve and too dangerous to ignore. If you find value in investigations of American industrial history, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which forgotten place to explore next. Your engagement makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the pit, before the poison, before anyone imagined that the richest hill on Earth would become one of the largest Superfund sites in America. The first prospectors arrived in the 1860s, drawn by rumors of gold in the streams that flowed from the mountains of southwestern Montana. They found some gold, enough to establish small camps and keep men digging through the harsh winters. But the gold was scattered and thin. nothing like the strikes in California or Colorado, nothing worth building a city around. What they found instead, and initially ignored, was a dull reddish rock that stained their tools and complicated their gold pans. Copper ore. Worthless in the 1860s when copper sold for pennies a pound and transportation costs made Montana mining uneconomical. The prospectors cursed the copper and kept looking for gold. Then the world changed. Thomas Edison developed the practical electric light bulb in 1879, demonstrating a technology that would transform human civilization. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone was spreading across cities. Telegraph wires already connected the continent. Suddenly, every city wanted electric lighting. Every building wanted to be wired. Every factory wanted electric power. And electricity required copper wire, miles of it. Thousands of miles, eventually millions of miles stretching across America and around the world, connecting homes and businesses and nations in a network of communication and power that had never existed before. The demand for copper exploded overnight, and the worthless red rock beneath Butte became the most valuable substance on Earth. The timing was perfect. A coincidence of geology and technology that would transform a remote Montana hillside into one of the most important places in America. The first copper mines opened in the early 1880s. Small operations at first, worked by individual miners and small partnerships. But copper mining required capital that individual miners couldn't provide. The ore bodies ran deep, requiring expensive tunneling. Processing the ore required smelters that cost fortunes to build. The scale of investment needed was beyond anything the gold rush had required. The Copper Kings arrived to provide that capital, and they transformed Butte from a mining camp into an industrial city, from a frontier settlement into the engine of American modernization. Marcus Daly came first, and his story was the story of immigrant ambition transformed by American opportunity. Born in Ireland during the Great Famine, Daly had emigrated as a teenager, worked his way across the country in mining camps, learned the business from the bottom up. By the time he arrived in Butte in 1876, he was already a skilled mining engineer with a reputation for identifying valuable deposits that others had overlooked. What Daly saw in Butte stunned him. The copper deposits were richer than anything he had encountered, richer than anything documented anywhere in the world. The veins ran deep and wide, containing ore that assayed at concentrations that seemed impossible. He acquired claims to what became the Anaconda Mine, named after the Union Army's strategy of encirclement during the Civil War, and began developing what would become the richest copper deposit ever discovered. But Daly understood that mining was only part of the equation. The ore was worthless until it was processed, and processing required infrastructure that did not exist. He built a smelter in a valley 26 miles west of Butte, founding a company town that took his mine's name, Anaconda. He constructed a railroad to connect the mines to the smelter, controlling transportation costs that would otherwise eat into profits. He acquired lumber operations to provide timber for the mine shafts, sawmills cutting trees from forests across western Montana. He built housing for his workers, stores where they could buy provisions, churches where they could worship. Marcus Daly was building not just a mine, but an empire. A vertically integrated industrial operation that controlled every step from ore extraction to finished copper. The model would be copied across American industry, but Daly pioneered it in the mountains of Montana, creating a system that would eventually stretch across the state and into the halls of political power in Washington. William Andrews Clark arrived with different methods but similar ambitions, and his rivalry with Daly would define Butte for a generation. Where Daly was earthy and direct, beloved by his workers for his lack of pretension, Clark was refined and calculating, a man who had educated himself in law and language and the manipulation of financial systems. A banker and merchant who had made his first fortune supplying mining camps with goods and credit, Clark recognized that the real wealth lay not in digging ore but in controlling the systems that processed, transported, and financed it. Clark acquired mines and smelters and banks and newspapers, building a network of interests that made him one of the richest men in America. He built a mansion in New York City that cost over $5 million, filled it with art collected from European dealers, and lived in a splendor that Daley, for all his wealth, never aspired to match. Clark wanted not just money, but status, not just power, but recognition, and he pursued both with a ruthlessness that made enemies at every turn. The third king was Frederick Augustus Heinze, younger and more reckless than his rivals, a mining engineer educated in Germany who arrived in Butte in 1889 with technical knowledge that neither Daley nor Clark possessed. Heinze understood geology in ways that the older men did not, and he exploited that understanding with a cunning that bordered on criminal genius. Heinze exploited the apex law, a legal doctrine that gave surface rights holders claim to ore bodies that apexed or reached their highest point beneath their property, regardless of where the ore extended underground. He filed lawsuits by the hundred, tying up Daley and Clark's operations in court while his miners followed veins wherever they led, even beneath his rivals' claims. The War of the Copper Kings, as newspapers called it, was fought in courtrooms and legislatures and the tunnels beneath Butte itself. Miners working for rival companies encountered each other underground, leading to fights and sabotage and occasional dynamite attacks. The kings bought judges and bribed legislators and published newspapers that attacked their enemies with vicious creativity. Clark famously won election to the U.S. Senate by bribing Montana legislators so openly that the Senate refused to seat him, a scandal that contributed to the constitutional amendment requiring direct election of senators. But while the kings fought each other for control of the copper, the real work happened underground, performed by men whose names appear on no stock certificates and whose fortunes consisted of whatever they could earn before the mines killed them. They came from Ireland and Cornwall and Wales, from Finland and Serbia and Italy, from China and Mexico, and every country where men were poor enough and desperate enough to descend into darkness, for wages that seemed generous compared to what they had left behind. By 1900, Butte was the most cosmopolitan city in the American West, home to immigrants speaking dozens of languages, worshiping in dozens of churches, maintaining traditions from homelands most would never see again. The Irish came in the largest numbers, recruited by Marcus Daley, himself an Irish immigrant who preferred to employ his countrymen, who trusted the men who shared his background and his faith. They dominated the skilled positions, the foreman jobs, the union leadership, the political machinery that ran the city and sometimes the state. They built Catholic churches on every corner, Irish social clubs in every neighborhood, a community so strong that Butte was called the most Irish city in America outside of Boston. But they were joined by Finns who established socialist halls and cooperative stores who brought radical politics and progressive ideals that challenged the company's control. By Serbs and Croatians who worked the most dangerous jobs in the deepest levels, who formed their own communities and maintained their own traditions. By Italians who opened restaurants and boarding houses and brought the cuisine of the old country to Montana mountainsides. By Chinese who had come for earlier mining booms and stayed to build laundries and restaurants, despite discrimination that confined them to the margins of society. By African Americans who found in Butte an opportunity unavailable in the Jim Crow South, even if that opportunity was underground in the darkness. The work that waited for them underground was the most dangerous industrial labor in America, more deadly than railroad construction or steel manufacturing or any other occupation that built the industrial nation. A miner's day began before dawn, walking through streets still dark, past saloons that never closed and boarding houses where the previous shift's workers were just falling into exhausted sleep. The streets smelled of sulfur from the smelters that processed ore around the clock, a yellow haze that hung over the city and stained buildings and burned throats. The smell was the smell of money, everyone said, but it was also the smell of poison, of chemicals that accumulated in lungs and bloodstreams and shortened lives by decades. At the mine collar, the miner waited with hundreds of others for the cage, a steel box barely large enough to hold the men crammed into it, suspended on cables that descended into darkness at speeds that made new men sick with fear and old men silent with resignation. The descent could take several minutes, dropping 2,000, 3,000, sometimes 4,000 feet. through rock that had been blasted and shored and carved into a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts and stopes that extended for miles in every direction. The temperature rose as the cage fell, climbing from the cool Montana air at the surface to over 100 degrees in the deepest levels, where miners worked nearly naked in conditions that would be recognized today as torture. The heat came from the earth itself, from the compressed rock that held warmth from the planet's formation. Ventilation systems moved air through the tunnels, but the air that reached the deepest workings was barely breathable, hot and thick and tasting of minerals and dynamite residue. At the bottom, the miner walked through tunnels supported by timber frames that creaked and groaned under the weight of the mountain above. The frames were made from trees cut in Montana forests, and they bent and splintered under pressures that no engineering could fully calculate. Sometimes they held, sometimes they didn't. The sounds of the mine were the sounds of stress and strain, of rock and wood in constant negotiation, of a weight that never stopped pressing down. Water dripped constantly, sometimes in streams that had to be pumped out around the clock by machinery that never stopped running. The water came from underground reservoirs, from infiltration through rock that had been fractured by 1,000,000 dynamite blasts, from sources that no one could fully map or predict. A trickle could become a flood in minutes, filling tunnels faster than men could run, drowning crews who had no warning until the water was at their waists. The air was thick with dust from drilling and blasting, silica dust that coated lungs and caused the silicosis that miners called miner's con because it consumed them from the inside. The dust was invisible in the dim light of carbide lamps, but it was always there in every breath, in every hour of every shift, accumulating grain by grain until lungs that had been pink and healthy turned white and stone. The work itself was drilling and blasting, an endless cycle of boring holes into rock faces, packing those holes with dynamite, detonating the charges, and mucking out the broken ore. Teams of miners used pneumatic drills powered by compressed air, heavy machines that vibrated with bone-rattling intensity, that raised clouds of dust with every inch of progress. The drilling could take hours. The blasting took seconds. The mucking took more hours still, loading broken rock into ore cars by hand, pushing those cars to shafts where hoists raised them to the surface. The dynamite was both tool and terror. Every miner knew stories of premature explosions, of charges that detonated while men were still setting them, of bodies so destroyed that identification was impossible. Every miner knew stories of missed holes, charges that failed to explode and then detonated when a drill bit struck them days later. The smell of nitroglycerin was constant underground, sweet and chemical, the smell of power and death intertwined. Accidents happened constantly, so frequently that the local newspaper ran a regular column documenting mining fatalities the way other papers documented weather. Rocks fell from ceilings and walls without warning, crushing men who had walked the same tunnels safely 1,000 times before. The geology was unpredictable, the stresses unknowable, the moment when stable rock became lethal impossible to anticipate. Cables snapped and dropped cages hundreds of feet, killing everyone inside in an instant of falling terror. The cables were inspected and replaced on schedules that the companies set, schedules that balanced safety against cost, that sometimes erred on the side of profit. A frayed cable that should have been replaced kept working until it didn't, and men died because someone had decided that replacement could wait another week. Dynamite exploded prematurely, detonating while miners were still setting charges, killing men who had performed the same operation successfully 100 times. Or it failed to explode and then detonated hours or days later when a drill bit struck a missed hole, killing men who had no idea the danger existed. The randomness was part of the horror. You could do everything right and still die. Fires broke out in the timber-supported tunnels, feeding on wood that had dried in the underground heat, filling shafts with smoke that suffocated men before they could escape. Once a fire started, it spread faster than men could run, faster than warnings could be communicated through miles of tunnels. Some men made it to the surface. Many didn't. Underground reservoirs of water broke through tunnel walls without warning, drowning entire crews in minutes. The water had accumulated over millennia in rock formations that miners had no way to detect. A pickaxe blow that had been routine 1,000 times before suddenly released a flood that filled tunnels before men could reach safety. The debt accumulated year by year, a toll that the companies recorded and the community mourned and the nation mostly ignored. Company records, incomplete and certainly understated, document over 2,000 deaths in the Butte mines between 1880 and 1920. The real number is certainly higher, perhaps much higher. Many deaths went unrecorded, especially in the early years before systematic documentation. Many injured men died later from wounds that seemed survivable but weren't. Many more died slowly from the diseases that mining bred: silicosis that turned lungs to white, tuberculosis that thrived in the weakened respiratory systems, lung cancer from radon gas that accumulated in poorly ventilated tunnels and was breathed day after day for years. The mining companies called these deaths the cost of doing business. The miners called them murder by negligence. The truth was somewhere in between, in a system that valued copper more than men, that treated workers as replaceable, that calculated safety investments against production costs, and often decided that production was more important. For the survivors, the wages were good by the standards of the time. A miner could earn $3 or $4 a day, twice what factory workers earned in eastern cities, enough to support a family, buy a small house, send children to school. The work was brutal and deadly, but it offered something that peasant life in Ireland or Finland did not: a chance at advancement, at ownership, at becoming something more than what your father had been. The dream of America was real in Butte, even if the reality was written in blood and lung tissue. Men who had been serfs in Europe became homeowners in Montana. Men whose fathers had worked land they could never own, bought property, and built houses and established families that would persist for generations. The mines killed thousands, but they also created communities, built a city, offered opportunities that existed nowhere else. The miners organized to protect what they had earned and to fight for more. The Butte Miners Union, founded in 1878, became the largest and most powerful local union in America. At its peak, it had over 18,000 members, enough to control city politics, enough to negotiate with the Copper Kings as something approaching equals. The union established insurance funds for injured workers, death benefits for widows, and hiring halls that gave organized labor control over who worked in the mines. But the power of the union was always contested, and the Copper Kings were always looking for ways to break it. The year 1914 brought crisis. A dispute over union governance turned violent when dynamite destroyed the Union Hall in June. In the chaos that followed, the National Guard occupied Butte. The mines operated under martial law, and the union that had represented workers for 36 years was broken. The companies imposed a new order, one where they controlled hiring and firing, where troublemakers were blacklisted, where the solidarity that had protected workers dissolved into fear. 3 years later, the disaster that everyone had always feared, that every miner knew was possible, that hung over every shift like a sentence waiting to be executed, finally came. June 8, 1917. The Granite Mountain shaft of the Speculator Mine. A Friday night, the start of a weekend that 168 men would never see. A crew was lowering a new electrical cable down the shaft, a routine operation performed countless times in mines across the district. The cable was coated with oil-soaked insulation, standard for the era, designed to protect the wiring from moisture and damage. As the cable descended, it scraped against the shaft wall. Friction generated heat. The insulation ignited. What happened next took only minutes but killed for hours. Fire raced down the cable, igniting the oil-soaked insulation throughout the shaft. The shaft acted as a chimney, drawing air upward and feeding the flames. Within minutes, the fire had spread to the timber supports that lined the shaft walls, to the wooden structures that divided the shaft into compartments, to everything that could burn. The men working underground had no warning. The first sign of danger was smoke, black and thick, pouring pouring through the tunnels from the direction of the shaft. Then the carbon monoxide came, invisible and odorless, displacing the oxygen that men needed to breathe. Some realized immediately what was happening. Some didn't understand until it was too late. There were 410 men working underground when the fire started. They were scattered across miles of tunnels at different levels in different workings, some close to the shaft and some far away. The smoke and gas spread through the ventilation system, poisoning the air in workings that seemed far from the fire. Men who thought they were safe died without ever seeing flames. The rescue efforts began within an hour, but the rescuers faced the same dangers as the trapped miners. The shaft was impassable, filled with fire and smoke. Other connections to the surface were limited, overwhelmed by men trying to escape. Rescue teams wearing early breathing apparatus descended through auxiliary shafts, searching for survivors in tunnels filled with gas. They found some men alive, barricaded in dead-end tunnels, breathing through wet clothing, waiting for rescue that they weren't sure would come. They found more men dead, sitting against tunnel walls as if resting, their lungs filled with carbon monoxide, their death so peaceful that they seemed asleep. They found groups of men who had tried to reach safety together, collapsed in corridors, their arms around each other, their final moments spent in solidarity with their fellow workers. The body count rose over days. 168 dead, the worst hard rock mining disaster in American history. The bodies were recovered one by one, carried to the surface on cages that had brought living men down that morning. Each body was identified if possible, photographed, documented. The youngest victim was 16 years old. The oldest was in his 60s. Most were in the prime of their lives, men with families and futures that ended in a tunnel 1,000 feet underground. Funerals overwhelmed the city's churches. The Catholic Church held service after service. The priests hoarse from prayers, the pews filled with widows in black. The Protestant churches did the same. The immigrant communities that made up Butte's population buried their dead according to their traditions, Finnish and Serbian and Italian and Irish, each group mourning in its own way, all sharing the same grief. Widows and orphans numbered in the hundreds. The company paid death benefits that were inadequate by any measure, a few $100s to compensate for a lifetime of lost wages. Some families received insurance payments from the union. Some received nothing. The burden of loss fell on those least able to bear it, on women who had no job skills and children who had no fathers, and communities that had lost the men who supported them. The anger that followed the speculator disaster reignited the labor movement. 15,000 miners walked off the job, demanding safety improvements, demanding union recognition, demanding respect for lives that the companies treated as expendable. The strike lasted into the fall, broken finally by federal intervention, by the wartime demand for copper, by the same forces that always broke strikes when the government sided with capital. The war that demanded copper also transformed Butte. Copper prices soared. Production accelerated. Men who might have left for safer work stayed for wages that war demand made possible. The city boomed even as it mourned. Money flowing through streets built on graves. After the war, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company consolidated control. The company had absorbed Marcus Daly's empire and grown to dominate not just Butte, but Montana itself. Anaconda owned the mines and the smelters and the railroads that connected them. It owned newspapers across the state, controlling information as thoroughly as it controlled ore extraction. It owned politicians and judges and the machinery of government at every level. Montana became a company state in ways that would be hard to exaggerate. Anaconda wrote laws and selected candidates and determined policy on everything from taxation to education. Critics called it the copper collar, the control that Anaconda exercised over public life. Journalists who challenged the company found themselves unemployed. Politicians who opposed its interests found themselves defeated. The democracy that was supposed to govern Montana functioned only within limits that Anaconda permitted. The miners who worked underground lived in this company state as subjects rather than citizens. Their wages were good, but their autonomy was limited. The company controlled housing and credit and access to jobs. To challenge Anaconda was to risk everything: employment, housing, the ability to live in the only community many workers had ever known. Through the 1920s and 1930s, and into the war years, the underground mines continued producing. The tunnels beneath Butte extended over 10,000 miles, a labyrinth that no single person could fully map, that connected thousands of individual workings into a system of extraction that had removed hundreds of millions of tons of rock from beneath the city. The ground itself began to change. Sinkholes appeared where old workings collapsed. Buildings cracked as the earth beneath them shifted. The maze of tunnels that had made Butte rich was making Butte unstable, hollowing out the foundation on which the city stood. Then Anaconda made a decision that would transform Butte more radically than anything that had come before. Open-pit mining had become economical for low-grade ore that contained copper concentrations too small to justify the expense of underground extraction. The technology was simple. Remove the earth that covered the ore, then remove the ore itself, processing vast quantities of rock to extract the copper it contained. The method was cheaper than underground mining, safer for workers, and capable of extracting ore that would otherwise remain in the ground. In 1955, Anaconda began digging the Berkeley Pit on the east side of Butte, and the city would never be the same. The pit started small, a test excavation to determine whether open-pit mining could work in Butte's geology. Within a year, it was clear that it could. The pit began expanding, consuming the surface acre by acre, swallowing everything in its path. The neighborhoods that disappeared had names and histories that stretched back to the city's founding. They were not just collections of buildings. They were communities, places where families had lived for generations, where children had been born and raised, where old people had expected to die in houses they had occupied for half a century. Meaderville was an Italian community established in the 1880s by immigrants from northern Italy. It had restaurants that served food from recipes brought across the ocean, boarding houses where new arrivals stayed until they found their footing, social clubs where men gathered to speak their language and maintain their traditions. Rocky's, Pierre's, the Capri. These restaurants were known throughout Montana, destinations for people who drove hours to eat authentic Italian food in an authentic Italian neighborhood. The pit consumed Meaderville entirely. Not a single building remains. McQueen was a residential area where mining families had built modest homes and raised children who went to local schools and played in local parks. Dublin Gulch was Irish, settled by immigrants who worked in the mines and built a community around St. Patrick's Church. Finntown was Finnish, with cooperative stores and socialist meeting halls and a sauna tradition that had survived the voyage from Scandinavia. Chinatown had housed Asian workers since the earliest mining days, a community that persisted despite discrimination and violence. One by one, they fell to the expanding pit. The process was called relocation, but it felt like exile. Families were told their homes would be demolished. They were offered compensation based on assessments that often undervalued their properties. They were given deadlines to leave. And then the bulldozers came, and houses that had stood for generations became rubble, and rubble became fill, and fill disappeared into the pit that was swallowing the city. Over 4,000 residents were displaced as the pit grew. Some took their compensation and bought homes in other parts of Butte. Some left the city entirely, unable to bear living in a place that was destroying itself. Some fought the company through legal channels, demanding better compensation, demanding the right to stay, demanding recognition that their homes were worth more than the company was willing to pay. Most lost. The company had lawyers and time and the law on its side. Individual homeowners had only their claims and their anger. The Italian restaurants of Meaderville became memories, survived only in recipe books and photographs, and the stories that former patrons told their grandchildren. The Finnish halls became legends, talked about by old-timers who remembered summer picnics and winter dances in buildings that no longer existed. The social fabric that had made Butte a community rather than just a collection of workers frayed and tore with each demolished block. The pit grew to over a mile wide and 1,800 feet deep, a hole so large it could be seen from space, so deep that the trucks working its floor looked like toys from the rim. The terraced walls descended in steps, each bench representing another layer of extraction, another removal of what had been solid ground. The trucks that hauled ore to the surface were the largest vehicles in the world, tires 12 feet tall, engines that burned hundreds of gallons of diesel per shift, beds that held 200 tons of rock at a time. From the rim, looking down, visitors felt vertigo even on solid ground. The scale was almost incomprehensible, a void in the earth that seemed too large to be human-made, too precise to be natural. The pit was both achievement and wound, proof of what industrial technology could accomplish and evidence of what that accomplishment cost. The underground mines closed as the pit expanded. The last deep mine ceased operations in 1975, ending nearly a century of underground work. The miners who had descended daily into the darkness found themselves unemployed or retrained for surface work that required different skills. The head frames that had defined Butte's skyline stood silent, monuments to an era that had ended. Then, in 1982, Anaconda made another decision. The pit was no longer profitable. Copper prices had fallen. Foreign competition had increased. The company announced it was closing all operations in Butte. The pumps that had kept groundwater from flooding the underground mines were turned off. Water that had been held back for a century began rising, filling the tunnels, dissolving the minerals in the rock, becoming the toxic soup that would eventually fill the pit itself. The Berkeley Pit became a lake, growing deeper each year, its water too poisonous to touch. The Superfund designation came in 1983, 1 year after Anaconda abandoned Butte. The Environmental Protection Agency declared Butte and the surrounding area one of the largest hazardous waste sites in America, a zone of contamination that extended from the pit through the mining district and downstream along Silver Bow Creek and the Clark Fork River for over 120 miles. The contamination was everywhere. The soil in residential yards contained arsenic at levels that made gardening dangerous and children's play potentially poisonous. The water in Silver Bow Creek ran orange with iron and heavy metals, a stream so polluted that nothing could live in it. The groundwater that residents depended on for drinking showed traces of contamination that required constant monitoring. The slag heaps that dotted the landscape leached toxins with every rainfall, spreading poison through the watershed. The cleanup began almost immediately and has continued for 4 decades with no end in sight. Workers in protective suits removed contaminated soil from yards and replaced it with clean fill. Engineers built treatment systems to filter water before it entered streams. Contractors capped waste piles and stabilized slag heaps and tried to contain contamination that had been spreading for a century. The cost has exceeded $1 billion, paid partly by the companies that caused the contamination and partly by taxpayers who never profited from the mining. Atlantic Richfield Company, which had acquired Anaconda's assets, became responsible for cleanup costs that dwarfed any value they had received from the purchase. The federal government contributed additional funds. The state of Montana negotiated settlements and oversaw remediation efforts that employed hundreds of workers for years on end. The people who remained in Butte found themselves living in a Superfund site, their city defined by contamination as much as by history. Real estate agents learned to explain the Superfund designation to potential buyers, to reassure them that the cleanup was progressing, to acknowledge that, yes, the most famous feature of their city was a pit full of poison. Property values that had already fallen with the closure of the mines fell further. Young people who might have stayed left for cities without toxic legacies. The population that had once reached 100,000 continued its decline toward 35,000 and below. Children grew up knowing that their yards had been tested for arsenic, that some houses had been demolished because the contamination was too severe to remediate, that the water from their taps was monitored for heavy metals. They learned not to play in certain areas, not to swim in certain streams, not to eat fish from certain waters. The Superfund became part of their education, a lesson in consequences that other American children never had to learn. But Butte did not die. The city persisted, stubbornly, proudly, defiantly, refusing to become another ghost town abandoned when the resource ran out and the contamination became too severe to ignore. The headframes that had defined Butte's skyline were preserved as historic landmarks rather than demolished as eyesores. 12 of them still stand. Gallows frames that once lowered men into darkness and raised ore into light. They are protected now, maintained by historical societies, illuminated at night as symbols of what Butte once was. Tourists photograph them against the Montana sky, not understanding fully what they represent, what they cost, how many men they helped kill. The mining history was commemorated rather than forgotten. The World Museum of Mining opened on the site of the Orphan Girl Mine, offering tours underground to visitors who wanted to understand what the work had been like. The exhibits explained the technology and the economics and the social history, tried to convey the experience of descending into darkness to dig wealth from the earth. School groups came on field trips. Families came on vacation. The museum became one of Butte's main tourist attractions, a place where the past could be encountered and at least partially understood. The Irish heritage that Marcus Daly had transplanted from County Mayo flourished into an annual St. Patrick's Day celebration that draws tens of thousands. For 1 week each March, Butte becomes the center of Irish America, with parades and concerts and celebrations that acknowledge the immigrant roots of the community. The bars stay open 36 hours straight. The streets fill with people wearing green. The city that copper built celebrates the heritage of the workers who built it. The labor history that had seen workers fight and die for dignity became a point of pride rather than embarrassment. Butte declared itself a union town and meant it, commemorating the struggles that had won the 8-hour day and worker safety laws and the right to organize. The speculator disaster was remembered annually. 168 names read aloud on the anniversary, a community acknowledging its dead. The working-class identity that had defined Butte for a century remained even after the work itself had ended. People who stayed in Butte stayed because they valued that identity, because they wanted to live in a place that remembered what labor had accomplished and what it had cost. They stayed because their families were here, because their histories were here, because Butte was home in a way that nowhere else could be. Efforts to clean the contamination have shown results. Silverbow Creek, once an open sewer of mining waste, now supports fish populations again. Some residential areas have been remediated, the arsenic-laced soil removed and replaced. The pit itself is being managed, its water treated to prevent overflow into the groundwater system. But the fundamental problem remains unsolved and may be unsolvable. The water in the Berkeley Pit continues rising, currently about 5,500 feet above sea level and climbing. If it reaches 5,410 feet, the critical level, it will begin flowing into the groundwater that supplies homes and businesses. A treatment plant processes millions of gallons annually, but the pit generates water faster than technology can clean it. The cost of perpetual treatment will be borne by generations who never benefited from the copper extraction. The communities displaced by the pit will never return. The 10,000 men who died in the mines will remain dead. The wealth that flowed from the richest hill on earth went elsewhere, leaving behind a population that lives with the consequences of decisions made by men who never lived here. Today, tourists stop at the viewing platform overlooking the Berkeley Pit. They take photographs of the terraced walls and the rust-colored water. Some throw pennies into the pit for luck, not realizing that the copper-laden water dissolves the coins within weeks. They read the interpretive signs that explain how copper built modern America, how Butte powered cities and connected communities and made possible the electrical infrastructure we take for granted. The signs do not mention the 10,000 dead. The signs do not describe the silicosis that filled lungs with iodate rock dust, or the widows who raised children alone on company death benefits. The signs do not explain how Anaconda controlled Montana like a feudal estate, or how workers who demanded better conditions found themselves blacklisted and evicted. The signs tell a story of progress and achievement, not of exploitation and death. The geese still land on the pit during migration season, despite the cannons and drones and propane exploders deployed to scare them away. The mining company that inherited responsibility for the pit employs workers whose only job is to harass birds, to keep them from landing on water that will kill them. Most geese take off again, warned by the noise, deterred by the harassment. But some land anyway, drawn by the expanse of water in an arid landscape, not understanding that the lake that promises rest will kill them before morning. Their bodies are removed quietly, the deaths noted in reports but not publicized to the media. The pit keeps its secrets, absorbs its victims, continues filling year by year with water that dissolves copper and leaches arsenic and grows more toxic with every passing month. The birds that die there become part of the contamination, their remains joining the chemistry of the pit, their deaths one more line item in the ongoing cost of a century of extraction. The mines beneath Butte are silent now, the tunnels flooded, the shafts sealed with concrete caps that are meant to last forever, but won't. 10,000 miles of passages that took a century to dig are filled with water and darkness, and the remains of men who were never recovered. Some of those men have names on tombstones in Butte cemeteries, memorialized even though their bodies lie underground. Others have no monuments at all, their identities lost with the records that documented them, their existence remembered only in census records and ship manifests and the fading memories of descendants who never met them. Above ground, the city continues. The old-timers gather in bars on Mercury Street and in union halls that still function even though the union has no contracts to negotiate. They tell stories of fathers and grandfathers who worked the mines, stories that grow more polished with each retelling, that preserve something essential about what this place was and what it meant. They remember names that appear on no historical markers, recall incidents that no book has recorded, keep alive a tradition of oral history that stretches back to the first Irish immigrants who descended into Butte's darkness. The bars stay open late, as they always have. Butte was a 24-hour city when the mines ran 3 shifts, and the drinking establishments that served those shifts never quite accepted normal business hours. You can still get a drink at 2 a.m. in Butte, still find a bar where someone will tell you about the old days, still encounter a working-class culture that persists, even though the work that created it has ended. But the young people still leave. The jobs that paid well are gone, replaced by service work and retail and the employment opportunities that come from being a small city in a state that doesn't have many cities at all. The future that mining promised, prosperity, security, a community that would last, turned out to be a temporary arrangement, a brief period when what lay underground was worth more than the lives required to extract it. The graduates of Butte's high schools scatter to Missoula and Bozeman and Billings, to Denver and Seattle and Portland, to anywhere that offers opportunities their hometown cannot match. Some come back eventually, drawn by family or nostalgia, or the indefinable pull of home. Most don't. The population continues declining. The median age continues rising. The city continues shrinking towards some final equilibrium that no one can predict. Can a city built on extraction survive when the extraction ends? Can a community poisoned by the industry that created it find a way forward that doesn't depend on that industry's return? Can the richest hill on earth become something other than a cautionary tale about the costs of American prosperity, a museum of industrial history, a Superfund site that will require management for centuries to come? Butte is still trying to answer these questions, still experimenting with tourism and heritage and the economic possibilities that remain when the primary possibility has been exhausted. The cleanup continues, slowly, expensively, with no clear endpoint in sight. The preservation efforts continue, maintaining headframes and historic buildings against the decay that claims abandoned structures. The people who remain continue living in a place that most Americans know only as an environmental disaster, a Superfund site, a pit full of poison where geese go to die. They know it as home. They know it as the place where their people came to build something, where their ancestors worked and died and raised families that persist into the present. They know the names of the mines and the miners. the history written in headframes and union halls and graves on the hillside. They carry that knowledge as burden and as pride, as grief and as identity, as something that defines them even when they wish it didn't. The richest hill on earth gave up its wealth and kept its ghosts. The city that prospered while the copper lasted now endures in the aftermath, managing contamination, commemorating history, waiting to see what comes next. The pit continues filling, the water rising a few feet each year, a slow-motion disaster that will unfold over decades or centuries, that no one alive today will see resolved. The tourists take their photographs at the viewing platform and leave, carrying images of the pit on their phones, telling friends about the toxic lake where birds go to die. The trucks on the interstate pass through without stopping, drivers who see the headframes and the pit and wonder briefly what happened here before returning their attention to the road. The world that Butte wired and lit has mostly forgotten where its power came from, what it cost, who paid the price. But the hill remembers. The pit remembers. The graves on the hillside remember, rows of markers bearing names from Ireland and Finland and Serbia, men who came seeking opportunity and found it and paid for it with their lives. The people who stayed remember, living with the consequences of the richest hill on earth, carrying stories that no one else will tell, waiting to see what comes next. 50 billion gallons of poison, 10,000 dead, $1 billion extracted, sent to stockholders in distant cities who never saw the mines and never met the men who worked them. A city that refuses to die, that persists in the shadow of the pit, that commemorates its dead and celebrates its heritage and tries to imagine a future that doesn't depend on the past. That is Butte, Montana. That is what remains of the richest hill on earth. The copper is gone. The men who dug it are gone. The wealth it generated built cities and fortunes elsewhere. What remains is the pit and the poison and the people who stay, who remember, who carry forward something that matters even if the world has forgotten what it was. The richest hill on earth. The deadliest mines in North America. The largest Superfund site in America. And a community that will not let itself become just another ghost town, just another abandoned place, just another story of extraction and abandonment. Butte endures. That itself is a kind of victory. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These investigations take time to research and produce, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, which forgotten American place should we explore next? The burning town of Centralia? The flooded villages of the Quabbin? The atomic city of Oak Ridge? The jungle ruins of Fordlandia? Every place has a story. Every story has a cost. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.